Okay, welcome along to the Make It Count podcast. It's great to be here with you, Matt, and any listeners. Thank you for
Yeah,
lending us your ears. I've heard people say that. It sounds weird.
yeah, and maybe eyes if you're watching on YouTube.
Oh, yeah.
If we get around to loading these up, David.
Hint, hint. Yes. So today we are talking about, well, what are we talking about, Matt?
The body keeps the score.
Yes. And that is a fairly popular or at least well-read book. Um, Your Body Keeps the Score by, is it Bessel van der Kolk?
Yeah, Van der Kolk.
Van der Kolk.
I don't know
Uh,
where he's from. I think he's from somewhere in Europe.
yes, yeah. Uh, and he's done 3 decades of work with trauma patients effectively. So that was war veterans, but otherwise as well. And his sort of ideas basically suggest that we keep trauma in our bodies. We often in psychology or psychiatry, counseling, it's all mental. It's how you're thinking. It's all up here. It's all cerebral. And so we just fix how you're thinking about things and everything will be good. And he's sort of going and saying that is probably not true, and that your body keeps a track of what has happened to you and you've experienced things, and it almost has a memory of itself. So it's quite interesting as a concept that lots of people have wrestled with. It's maybe not classically Western sort of understanding of the body.
Mm. Yeah, absolutely. And the way that I heard one person sort of put it was certainly when it comes to the trauma space, like normal memories are kind of formed a bit like a ribbon, they said. It's got a beginning, a middle, an end, and it's got a nice rounded out. But like traumatic memories are almost like shards of glass,
Hmm.
and they are fragmented and they are sharp, and they can just appear at any time, be triggered by a smell or a certain, uh, sight or something, and it doesn't feel like it's something that happened in the past. It feels like it's happening presently, which is really interesting. It's something that I've never, I suppose, experienced, and that sort of level of trauma. But something about the body memory almost makes it feel current,
Hmm.
rather than something in the past.
Yeah, and I think that's to do with like PTSD
Yeah,
and post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the things is another podcaster I quite like. He's also a psychologist. He talks about it's Michael Gervais. He talks about big T trauma and little T trauma,
yeah,
and how some people have experienced that diagnosable big T trauma, the the war veterans, and actually, even I was looking at some reviews for the book. I think this book by Your Body Keeps the Score says 1 in 5 Americans have been molested, which is crazy. That's like big T trauma. So 1 in 4 grew up with knowing an alcoholic. That has its own trauma as well. So 1 in 3 couples experience violence. And you're like, well, that's crazy. That's big T trauma. But we've all experienced maybe little T trauma, or maybe another word would be helpful there. Um, yeah.
yeah. That's definitely something that I have come across, and I quite like that as a distinction, uh, because perhaps perhaps to those who have experienced real trauma, it might be almost dishonoring to kind of treat other things as on the same level. But
Mm.
then to recognize, oh, well, just because I haven't experienced that, and of course, we don't want people to have experienced that, but that doesn't mean that I haven't suffered and suffered many small traumas. Maybe they're grazes or whatever, but they still leave their mark. And yeah, so that's something kind of I suppose we're going to talk a little bit about today.
Yeah, because I think the main idea, your body keeps a score, it kind of says the idea really in that sentence is that things happen to us, we experience things, but then that is kept in our bodies. And he even suggests, he quotes quite a lot of research that the traumatic experiences rewire your brain so that it changes how you experience pleasure and engagement and control and trust and these ideas. And so whilst that's true in the extreme of maybe the big T trauma that he's talking about, I suppose I wonder if it's true in the little T trauma. In fact, with everything, and that just we kind of need to talk about that rediscovery of the mind body connection. That
Yeah,
actually there was an idea that has become quite well talked about, but maybe isn't true, but that we're just sort of brains on a stick, as it were,
yeah. Brains on a leg, isn't it?
something like that.
Yeah, our body is basically just a machine to move our brain around. But that's, I think, yeah, and my understanding is the more that the research is on the human body, the more you just think that's totally crazy. There's the stomach and all the and just yeah, in was it intestines? No,
Yep.
digestive system
Yep.
has so many connections. It's almost like a second brain, and
Mm.
so yeah, how many of us have said, I feel like I'm being led by my brain, by my stomach? It's like, well, actually, you might be, your stomach might be making some decisions for you, some pre-decisions.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. And I think I don't know 100% where that idea came from. I think I've heard people talk about it's this idea of the Enlightenment, where I think therefore I am. That was Descartes, wasn't it? And
believe
and
so.
actually that sort of rationalizing, like everything is about logic, and just because I'm thinking about it is true, and it doesn't matter what happens with our bodies. And
And it even goes
ultimately,
back to Socrates, and I suppose that's part of what uh, the Renaissance with art, but maybe the Enlightenment was also trying to recapture some of those ancient Greek and maybe Roman ideas. But Socrates was very much in that school of thought of, oh, the reason people don't live well or don't live rightly is because they don't think rightly. So we just need to educate people so that they think rightly. But it just seems like the more um, research is done on so many different aspects of life now over longitudinal studies, that's not true. For example, the whole 5 a day thing, eat 5 fruit and veg a day. When that campaign started in I think it was in the States, but it might be the UK. um, I was listening to this recently. They basically said when that campaign first started, only like 7% of the population was aware that that was a good target to aim for. But actually, like maybe nearly 15% of people were eating that. 20 years later, or 5 years, or 10 years later after that, 30% or more of the population knew that was what was good for them, but only 9% were, or something, or even less than that. And so it's like, oh, so good knowledge doesn't equate to right living. You would think as more people knew about it, more people would do it. But actually, what they found is it was much more um, impactful for the positioning of products in shops and the nudge thing. And it's the decision in the moment that matters. It's not the, oh, well, I know this, out there at a time. And so if a decision, if knowledge can help you make a one-time decision at that point, which will lead to further consequences that are good, then yes, knowledge is an important under underlying thing. But if it's a case of this is a decision that needs to make multiple times, actually it's what's the environmental factors going on, and then maybe what's the internal environment that I've built up. And I think that then is kind of links to what we're talking about today, what's the internal structure, what's going on in my body that then influences the way I live and the way that I perceive life and the decisions I make.
yeah, and I've heard people talk about that campaign as simultaneously being the most successful or one of the biggest failures, because
Yeah.
it was a big public information campaign, and it really everyone knows that information now, the 5 a day. But in terms of actual behavior change, it failed. Like,
Mm.
people were not more likely to do it. In fact, like you said, less people do it now than did 20 years ago, even if they lacked the knowledge. And there are other factors at play,
Yeah.
in that the world has changed quite a lot in the last 20 years. But it is interesting, like you said, that we aren't just thinking beings. Many times, just without looking at the big picture and the small thing, we know what we should do, but
Mm.
we don't do it. Like, I know
Yeah.
I shouldn't have gone and eaten another biscuit just now, but I did. Uh, and so whether it's food, whether it's even how we relate to other people, oftentimes we know what we want to do. We know that ultimately the right thing to do many times, but we don't do it. And so knowledge doesn't always equal that. And I suppose the other side of this as well is not just that knowledge doesn't equal that, but that it seems really obvious to say it, but we lost it somewhere. But experiences impact us mentally, emotionally, and physically. They impact in our mind and our body and wherever our emotions come from, which is the mind and the body as well. So there you go.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it was the that the term came up, just body memory, in one of the videos I watched, and I think that was quite a powerful idea of just, yeah, we talk about muscle memory and in terms of sport, and I used to think, oh well, that's not really like a true thing. It's really stored in the brain, but like it just feels like it's muscle memory. But actually, there are certain movements, certain reflexes that they never have to make their way up the spinal column into the mind and back. Literally, it gets to the spinal column and goes back. And that's, that in a sense really is muscle memory. And I think this is the same order of being. There are some experiences that are so powerful, or maybe just have been repeated so many times that they seep into other areas of our our body that then affect the way that we sit, that we breathe, that we act. One example they brought out was really interesting. They were saying, there are certain people that may have experienced, like extremely aggressive or like violent adults in their childhood, and so what they maybe have learned to do is basically learn to be really passive and very still and very almost calm. And so from a mental point of view, it might seem like they're being meek and controlled, but in their body, it's like they've almost restricted themselves from any fast movement and any sudden things, because they've tied those two things together with, if I do things suddenly, there's a high chance that something bad's going to happen. And so actually they were saying they might have a predisposition to dislike exercise and running, because in their body that feels like something bad is going to happen to me if I start moving quickly. So like, that's got nothing to do with laziness. It's got nothing to do with not liking exercise. It's got to do with this in their body feeling of, if I move quickly, bad things are going to happen. Oh, that is so, and that's not necessarily a thought through. That's not even something that you could like kind of memory and just. And there's aspects of, yes, you want to talk through that and help that, but then you have to go, oh well, in order to get beyond that and break through that, I can't just talk about it and go, yes, well that's irrational and I shouldn't be afraid of running. You actually have to learn to unlearn that learned behavior. And the Van der Kolk, in one of his clinics that they set up, it was this, I think they called it a sensory integration clinic, where they created this effectively this safe space, playground like thing, open for kids and adults, where there was just lots of fun things to do, very childlike swings and soft cushions and everything. And the whole idea was that they would encourage people to have experiences that deeply and viscerally contradict the helplessness, the rage, or the collapse that resulted from the trauma that they faced. I think it's like deep and visceral were the words that stood out there. It's not just okay, I've mentally learned, yeah, that was the thing that happened and that's led to this. I have to now bodily learn something that contradicts that lesson.
Yeah, because it felt the same when there's a violent adult there.
Yeah.
I respond like this, and I'm rigid, and actually, but inside I'm doing crazy sort of, who knows what's going on, and then I go for a run. Well, that feels the same. Oh, don't do that then. I'm in danger, and it's like, well, how do you transgress that? Because even having a conversation about that, you probably wouldn't be able to unpick that.
Yeah.
There's just, it's a very strong emotive feeling of, I don't want to run.
Yeah.
Why? Well, I don't know. It feels awful. It's like, well, the part of me is like, well, just because exercise sometimes is hard if you haven't done it for a while. But actually, that's not it at all. Like you said, and so it is very interesting. And for many of us, even though those numbers I sort of said earlier that were on the book, 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 1 in 3, they're still the minority. Like the majority of people probably still haven't experienced big T trauma.
Yeah.
So is this still applicable? Well, I would suggest that those are the extremes. The big T traumas are the experiences of many people, but it's the extreme experience. But we all experience things that do impact us in our bodies, in our emotions, mentally. And this is obvious because people who work in a job that spend all day sitting, they can get really stressed. And where do you feel that? Well, you might feel that in your neck, in your shoulders, in your back. You might get a headache or a migraine, for example. And that's nothing to do with doing exercise and your back that is tense and tight. It's not a physical stress, it's a mental stress that impacts physically. And so again, it seems really obvious to say that there's a connection between what happens in our mind and our mentals and what happens in our body, but so often we don't treat the same. And in the same way that, like, well, so recently I moved house and it went really smoothly, but it was still very stressful. There's so many things that change, there's so many things you're trying to coordinate and arrange to happen. And a couple of days after we moved, even though it went really smoothly, even though I was feeling really good about the place we've bought and that we've moved into, I got a migraine, like a really bad migraine. And it was because I was so stressed and I was feeling it in my body, and I just felt it coming along, and then it was, in my brain. And I had to take like a double dose of what I would normally have for medicine to make it go away. It was like a really severe one.
Wow.
It wasn't like someone bunked me on the head, that was a lived experience, mental, but affected me physically. Well, massaging my head isn't going to take my migraine away. It will help somewhat, but actually if the trigger is mental, and so it's that inverse relationship, I think, is really interesting. Well,
Yeah, that's interesting.
inverse, co-directional relationship, both directions.
Yeah, co-directional, bidirectional. Yeah, and it's that thing of the mind can impact the body can impact the mind, and it all swiggles around, and somewhere the soul gets involved as well, I think. I think for me, one story that comes to mind when we were talking about this is a couple of years old, going back to when we were working on the ship and Logos Hope, and I had been working basically as a solo man department, looking after the air conditioning, the refrigeration, the ventilation aboard this ship for 9 months ish at this point. Actually, it'd been we joined the ship about a year previous, but I'd been working about it for 9 months on my own, and it had just been a draining period of my life, and I had seriously considered at certain points going, I don't think I can continue. I think I need to pack it in and go home, and that was less than halfway through a 2-year commitment. And I'm very much, you can vouch for this, David, I'm not someone who once is committed for something, I'm going to be like, just back out lightly. So I was really struggling through that time. And it was more than just a bit of work stress. It was physically exhausting. I was often working 10, 12-hour days to try and solve problems that were beyond my normal experience, and I was trying this and that, and things weren't working. And then there was a whole month long, actually more than that, 6 weeks long dry dock period, which is where half the ship's crew disappear off and do other things, the rest stay bare and just look after this many projects. And during that time, because we were working on the air conditioning was shut off, and it was in Mexico, it was 35 degrees plus each day, outside temperature, inside temperature even more, and that was physically and emotionally draining. And there was stress within the department and challenges and clashes with people, and so all of that just built up and built up and built up. And there was a reprieve for a few months where basically some of the work situation was calmed down, so those strains disappeared. But what really struck me was I took, at the end of September, like a 4 or 5 day break away from the boat, from everything, in a cool city in Guatemala. Really enjoyed that, and felt great. Okay, wow, I feel like I'm getting back to me, reconnected and everything. So I came back from that break and I thought, great, I'm reconnected, I'm going to be fine and rested. But as soon as I got back into work, it was like my body had switched, something had switched in my body, and I couldn't do a full day's work. So I would maybe do the morning and come back to the cabin for lunch and So I'd just lie down for a half an hour and then grab lunch and carry on. And I would wake up and it'd be dinner time, or most of the way through the afternoon, or even later sometimes. Or counter that, I would sometimes go to sleep at night and then wake up and it would be halfway through the morning or nearly lunchtime when I woke up. And I was at that time confused, but also kind of berating myself, like, man, you got to work better than this. They're putting trust in you to do the work, and you're just like sleeping all the time. You're just like, you can't do anything. And it was only like months later that I realized I needed to maybe give myself a little bit more grace and go, well, hang on, like, you've been working overtime for the best part of a year. Your body is going to, at some point, call that debt up, in a sense. And I don't think I was able to, if I'd known this book was, and the stuff here, it probably would have been really helpful, because I would have said, well, obviously what I need to do is give myself that time to recover, just physically, but also like maybe delve into some of in what ways do we need to like reconnect with, like, what's going on and what is the stuff that needs to be healed here. And it was only really after I'd left the environment that I was able to do some of that work later on. But it was, I was thinking back on it, and I was basically knocked out in this sort of period for about 6 to 8 to 9 weeks, which kind of corresponds, funnily enough, to the 6 to 9 months of the period in which I had been really overdrawn. So I wonder if there's an aspect of there, or it might just be a completely coincidental.
Yeah, and it is, like you said, it requires us to pay attention. And I think so often, I mean, that was like quite an extreme situation, but so often we are distracted from paying attention to our bodies. And there's many things out there to distract us from paying attention. And I was actually thinking, even in preparation for this episode, about probably most of my last several football injuries. I kind of knew I was going to get injured, because my body was like, you're tired, you're worn out, you're ill, whatever. And I was like, well, I'll play anyway. And then I get injured. And it's like, oh, my body was going, you're not physically ready to perform. And then you put yourself in a competitive situation, and I got injured. And it's like, oh, like, really? If I was paying enough attention and gave that I didn't put it down as, oh, you're just a bit mentally tired, but actually went, oh, my body is telling me right now that I'm not ready to perform. Like, get your pride out of the way right now. Don't play, because you're going to get injured. But every time I don't give it enough weight. Like, even if I've like noticed it, and maybe usually I noticed it better in hindsight. It's like, I did actually know I was going to get injured. Like, I thought about it. I processed that, but I did anyway. So I suppose as we wrap up this episode, it's just that reminder that your body does matter. Your body is speaking to you, and it's listening to you as well. It's listening to how you treat it, what you put into it, but it's also speaking to you and telling you, hey, this is what's up. This is where we're going. And so we're not just a brain on legs, but our mind and our body, there is a connection there. And people in exercise talk about that. Don't just exercise and watch a video, actually exercise and think about the working muscles, because apparently that has been shown to have greater activation of your muscles if you think about the muscles that you're using. And it seems like, well, if I'm pushing the same weight, why does it matter what I'm thinking about? But it turns out it definitely matters what you're thinking about when you exercise. And so this was Your Body Keeps the Score was a book really on trauma, big T trauma, but there are lessons there for all of us about the connection between our mind and our body. So thank you for joining us. I hope you found
before we finish, I just want to, there's a couple of things I think it's worth pointing out, a couple of ideas that they found really helpful, obviously for trauma recovery, but I think just generally for us, because we're in a space where so many of us now, we don't actually work with our bodies. So many people work in a sedentary role. And so like those who are doing stuff with their bodies more often are probably already more likely to be in touch with their body a little bit more, in connection. They said these activities that they found worked really well helped people to regain connection with their body. So it could be something as simple as singing or chanting, especially with group, or meditation and prayer. Obviously, like mindfulness is a very popular thing right now. Sports and dancing, so it's coordinated, but it's working with other people. And then like yoga and Tai Chi. So things that You are, as you said, exactly that. You're applying thought to what's going on in your body, but there's control to it, or maybe there's rhythm to it, and music, and there's connection, human element of connection as well. In certainly with some of those more tender connections, maybe with some sports it's not so tender, but I think that's just a helpful, like, if you're coming to the end of this discussion and going, oh, that's great, but like, what are some handholds? Those are some handholds. Explore that. The social, the body connection is reconnecting with your body and also with other people.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really good. I think it's really great to have some handholds of what to do and how we can work with this. Let us know as well at home, people that are listening, what are your experiences of this, of your body keeping the score? We would love to hear that and hear what you're thinking about these things. But that's all for this week. Thank you for joining us in another episode of the Make It Count podcast.